The wedding of the decade was supposed to be a flawless merger of two elite dynasties. Instead, the groom's family deliberately locked the bride's working class parents out in the freezing rain, deeming them too low status to mingle with high society. But the wealthy in laws made one fatal miscalculation. They had no idea the bride's humble father was the only man in the world who could summon the one guest capable of destroying their entire empire with a single sentence. The Van der Art family did not just have money, they had the kind of generational wealth that insulated them from the consequences of reality. Their name was plastered across Manhattan skyscrapers, whispered in the boardrooms of Geneva, and engraved on the heavy brass plaques of private Swiss banks. Into this terrifyingly immaculate world stepped Madeline. Madeline was a brilliant, hardworking historic preservationist from Brooklyn. She spent her days covered in plaster dust, restoring the intricate cornices of forgotten brownstones. She was grounded, fiercely loyal to her roots, and hopelessly in love with Harrison van der Art. Harrison was the heir apparent to the Van der Art empire, yet with Madeline, he was just a man captivated by her warmth and authenticity. He had proposed under the rain-soaked awnings of a small cafe, swearing that his family's suffocating legacy would never touch them. But Harrison was profoundly naive. The moment the engagement ring, a 5-carat flawless emerald-cut diamond that felt entirely too heavy on Madeline's finger, was slipped on the invisible machinery of the Van der Art family, kicked into high gear. The matriarch Eleanor van der Art was a woman who wielded passive aggression like a scalpel. Eleanor was a fixture of the Upper East Side elite, a woman who communicated her disdain through tight smiles and meticulously worded compliments that always carried a hidden sting. Madeline, darling. Eleanor had purred during their first planning luncheon at the Pierre Hotel, her eyes sweeping over Madeline's modest off-the-rack tailored suit. We are simply thrilled. Harrison has always had a penchant for charity cases. It shows his tremendous heart. We will, of course, be handling the entirety of the wedding arrangements. The Van der Art reputation demands a certain standard. Madeline had bristled but kept her composure. Harrison and I were hoping for something intimate, Eleanor. My parents and I have been looking at a beautiful botanical garden in a garden. Eleanor interrupted, offering a laugh that sounded like tinkling ice. Oh, sweetheart, this isn't a high school prom. We have already secured the Rosecliff Mansion in Newport for the ceremony and the grand ballroom at the plaza for the reception. The guest list is nearing 800. The friction only escalated from there. Madeline's parents, Robert and Martha, were the antithesis of the Van der Arts. Robert owned a small, cluttered antique clock repair shop in Bay Ridge, a trade passed down through 3 generations. His hands were calloused, permanently stained with oil and brass polish, but he carried himself with a quiet, unbreakable dignity. Martha was a retired public school teacher, a woman whose entire life revolved around her family. They had poured their life savings into Madeline's education, and seeing their daughter marry into such a powerful family filled them with both immense pride and a gnawing, unspoken anxiety. Eleanor made her moves with calculated precision, executing a campaign of social warfare designed to remind Madeline and her family exactly where they stood. The first blow came with the invitations. When the heavy gold-leafed invitations were finally printed, Madeline noticed something horrifying. Her parents' names were conspicuously absent from the formal hosting line. Instead of Mr. and Mrs. Robert, it simply read, "The Van der Art family requests the honor of your presence at the marriage of their son Harrison to Madeline." It was a glaring, deliberate erasure of her heritage. When Madeline confronted Eleanor in the sunroom of their sprawling Hamptons estate, Eleanor barely looked up from her tea. "It is simply a matter of etiquette, Madeline. The family funding the event claims the top line. Your parents, bless them, aren't exactly equipped to host a gala for senators and international dignitaries. We are sparing them the embarrassment." "They are my parents." Madeline had snapped, her voice trembling with barely suppressed rage. "They are not an embarrassment." Harrison had stepped in, placing a placating hand on Madeline's shoulder. "Mom, please. Let's not make this difficult. Maddie is just stressed." It was the first time Madeline felt a true fracture in her relationship. Harrison wasn't defending her. He was managing the situation. He had spent his entire life avoiding his mother's wrath, and he wasn't about to start standing his ground now. As the wedding drew closer, Eleanor's tactics grew bolder. She scheduled dress fittings at exclusive Parisian boutiques on weekdays, fully aware that Martha could not afford to fly to Europe on a Tuesday. She arranged floral consultations and menu tastings during the exact hours Robert's shop was busiest. By the time the final month arrived, Robert and Martha had been entirely iced out of the planning process, relegated to the status of distant spectators at their own daughter's wedding. But the final insult before the wedding weekend was the most insidious. Eleanor had sent over a wardrobe consultant to the small Brooklyn apartment. The consultant politely but firmly suggested that Martha's chosen mother-of-the-bride dress, a lovely modest navy blue gown she had saved up for months to buy, was not quite aligned with the aesthetic of the evening. Instead, Eleanor had sent over an aggressively drab, shapeless beige dress that looked more suited for a scullery maid than the mother of the bride. Robert had watched his wife fight back tears as she looked in the mirror at the beige monstrosity. He placed his calloused hands on her shoulders, his jaw tight. "You don't have to wear it, Marty," he whispered. "I will wear it," Martha replied, her voice breaking. "I won't let that woman ruin Madeline's day. If it makes her happy, I will swallow my pride." Robert's eyes darkened, but he said nothing. He simply reached into his pocket and fingered a heavy tarnished silver coin, a relic from a lifetime ago, a token from a man to whom Robert had once given everything. Robert had never intended to call in the debt, but Eleanor van der Art was pushing a very quiet man to a very dangerous edge. The rehearsal dinner was held in the legendary Rainbow Room at Rockefeller Center. The skyline of Manhattan glittered beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, a sea of diamonds spread out beneath the feet of the elite. The room was packed with politicians, hedge fund managers, and media moguls. It was less a celebration of love and more a networking summit for the ultra-rich. Madeline stood near the bar, her stomach twisting into painful knots. She was wearing a stunning silk gown, but she felt like a hostage. She kept checking her watch. It was 8:30 p.m. Her parents were supposed to have arrived an hour ago. She pulled Harrison aside. "Harrison, where are they? My parents should have been here." Harrison sighed, swirling his scotch. "I'm sure they just got caught in traffic, Maddie. You know how the bridge gets on a Friday night." But Madeline knew her father. Robert was a man of time. He repaired clocks for a living. He was never late to anything in his entire life. Panic beginning to well in her chest, she marched out to the lobby and called his cell phone. It rang 4 times before Robert answered. "Dad, where are you?" "We're downstairs, sweetheart." Robert's voice was uncharacteristically tight. There seems to be a misunderstanding." Madeline rushed down to the ground floor lobby. What she saw made the blood roar in her ears. Her parents were standing off to the side, looking completely out of place in the opulent marble-floored lobby. Martha was clutching her purse defensively, wearing the hideous beige dress Eleanor had forced upon her. Robert stood tall, but there was a deep flush of humiliation on his neck. They were blocked by 2 massive private security guards holding tablets. "What is going on here?" Madeline demanded, striding up to the guards. One of the guards looked down his nose at her. "Ma'am, these individuals are not on the approved VIP guest list for the Rainbow Room tonight. They are the parents of the bride." Madeline shouted, her voice echoing in the polished lobby. "My apologies, miss, but Mrs. Eleanor van der Art provided the finalized list an hour ago. She specifically instructed that only those with VIP credentials be allowed up. She mentioned there was a secondary overflow dinner occurring at the hotel restaurant next door for extended associates." Madeline felt like she had been slapped. Eleanor had deliberately scrubbed their names from the door list, attempting to banish them to a public restaurant while the elite dined in the sky. "Let them through right now, or the wedding is off." Madeline hissed, her eyes blazing. The guard, sensing the absolute venom in her tone, finally relented and swiped them in. When they reached the Rainbow Room, the humiliation only deepened. Madeline led her parents to the main family table, only to find it completely occupied by Eleanor's distant cousins and business partners. Eleanor, adorned in dripping diamonds, noticed them and stood up with an expression of feigned shock. "Oh, Robert, Martha, you made it!" Eleanor called out, her voice carrying across the silent room. People turned to stare. "I was so certain you would prefer the quieter atmosphere downstairs. This crowd can be quite overwhelming for people unaccustomed to such noise." "We are here for our daughter," Robert said, his voice deadly calm. Of course, of course. Well, let's find you a spot." Eleanor snapped her fingers and a maitre d' scurried over. Instead of making room at the main table, Eleanor had her staff guide Robert and Martha to a small, cramped table in the absolute darkest corner of the room, right next to the swinging doors of the kitchen. Every time the waiters passed, the doors bumped against Robert's chair. Madeline started to follow them, tears of fury pricking her eyes. "I'm sitting with them." Harrison grabbed her arm. "Maddie, please, don't make a scene. My mother has the governor of New York at our table. You have to sit with us. It's expected." "Harrison, look at where she put them," Madeline choked out. "It's just for tonight." Harrison pleaded, his eyes begging her to comply. "I promise tomorrow will be different. Tomorrow is about us. Just get through tonight." Against her better judgment, Madeline let herself be led back to the head table. She sat there for 2 hours picking at her caviar, her heart breaking every time she looked across the room to see her parents isolated by the kitchen doors eating their meals in silent dignity. When it came time for speeches, Eleanor tapped her crystal flute with a silver spoon. The room fell dead silent. She stood radiant and toxic. "We are gathered here to celebrate a union." Eleanor began, her voice projected perfectly. "When Harrison first told me about Madeline, I admit I had my reservations. The Van der Art legacy is a heavy mantle. It requires breeding poise and an understanding of our unique world. But Madeline has shown an admirable eagerness to leave her past behind and elevate herself to our standards." Gasps of uncomfortable laughter rippled through the sycophantic crowd. Madeline gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white. "So, to Harrison and Madeline," Eleanor raised her glass. "May you build a future that looks entirely forward and never looks back." As the room applauded, Madeline looked toward the kitchen doors. Her father wasn't clapping. Robert was looking directly at Eleanor Van der Art. The quiet, humble clockmaker's eyes were cold, calculating, and completely devoid of fear. He took out his phone, a worn, older model, and typed a single brief message. It was time to call the emperor. The wedding day dawned bitter and freezing. A freak unseasonal coastal storm had swept over Rhode Island, plunging temperatures and whipping icy winds off the Atlantic. The Rosecliff mansion stood like a fortress against the gray sky, its massive iron gates heavily guarded by an army of private security dressed in black trench coats. Inside the mansion was a vision of excessive, almost grotesque luxury. Tens of thousands of white orchids had been flown in from Thailand, cascading from the gilded ceilings. A 40-piece string orchestra warmed up in the grand hall. Waiters in white ties circulated with trays of vintage champagne. Madeline sat in the bridal suite numb. Her makeup artist fluttered around her, adjusting her veil. She had spent the entire morning trying to reach her parents, but their phones went straight to voicemail. A creeping dread had settled in her chest. Harrison had assured her that he had personally spoken to his mother and that there would be no misunderstandings today. Downstairs, the truth was unraveling in the cruelest way possible. Robert and Martha had arrived at the front gates in a rented sedan dressed in their finest attire. Martha had refused to wear the beige dress, opting instead for her beautiful navy gown. Robert wore a classic, well-pressed tuxedo. But as they approached the towering oak doors of the mansion's main entrance, a line of 4 broad-shouldered security men blocked their path. "Tickets and lanyards, please." The head of security barked, not making eye contact. "We are the parents of the bride." Robert set his voice steady against the howling wind. "We don't have tickets." The guard looked down at his clipboard, flipping through a few pages. He tapped his earpiece, listening for a moment, then looked back at Robert with a sneer. I have strict instructions from Mrs. van der Art. Nobody enters without the gold-embossed lanyards. No exceptions. Furthermore, your names are flagged on the secondary list as prohibited access to the main house. Martha gasped, pulling her coat tighter against the freezing wind. Prohibited. This is my daughter's wedding. You can't be serious. Ma'am, I suggest you step off the stairs. The wind chill is dropping. There's a tent set up near the service entrance for staff and non-credentialed vendors. You can wait there until the ceremony is over, at which point you may be escorted in for a photograph. It was the ultimate calculated strike. Eleanor hadn't just humiliated them, she had literally locked them out of the house in the freezing cold, treating them like unwanted stray dogs. "We are going inside," Robert said, taking a step forward. Two of the guards immediately stepped up, placing their heavy hands on Robert's chest, shoving him back hard enough that he stumbled on the icy stone steps. Martha cried out, grabbing his arm to keep him from falling. "Touch me again," Robert said, his voice dropping to a terrifying, gravelly register, "and you will regret it for the rest of your miserable life." Upstairs, Madeline finally broke away from her handlers. She practically ran down the grand staircase, her heavy gown sweeping the marble. "Where are they?" she demanded to the wedding planner. "Where are my parents?" The planner looked nervous, checking her tablet. Mrs. van der Art said they had a slight delay and requested to wait in the vendor tent. "The vendor tent!" Madeline screamed. She shoved past the planner and ran toward the front doors. Eleanor intercepted her in the foyer, stepping elegantly into Madeline's path. "Madeline, stop this at once. You are ruining your makeup." "Where are my parents?" "Eleanor." Madeline's voice shook with an absolute primal rage. Eleanor sighed, adjusting a diamond bracelet. They arrived without their credentials, and they were causing a scene with security. Frankly, their attire was entirely inappropriate for the photographs. I had security escort them to a holding area. They will be brought in for one quick photo after the vows. Now stop being dramatic and get back upstairs. You locked them outside in this weather. Madeline looked around wildly for Harrison. He was standing near the fireplace, looking pale, completely frozen. "Harrison, do something." Harrison opened his mouth, then looked at his mother. Eleanor shot him a withering glare. Harrison swallowed hard. "Maddie, maybe it's for the best. Just for the ceremony. We'll bring them in right after." In that exact moment, Madeline's love for Harrison died. It didn't fade. It was instantly extinguished, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. She reached up to her veil and prepared to rip it off her head, fully intending to walk out the front door and never look back. But before she could pull the pins from her hair, the massive oak doors of the mansion were suddenly violently blown open, a gust of freezing wind sweeping through the grand foyer, extinguishing the candles. The security guards outside were shouting in panic. Through the open doors, Madeline, Eleanor, and the entire foyer, full of elite guests, saw something that made their blood run cold. A convoy of 12 heavily armored jet-black Maybachs had just breached the main gates, completely ignoring the security checkpoints. They tore up the gravel driveway, screeching to a halt in a perfect semicircle around the front steps. The vehicles flew a very specific, terrifyingly recognizable diplomatic flag, the royal crest of the House of Valerius. Eleanor's face drained of all color. What is happening?" she stammered. The van der Art family empire had been desperately trying to secure a partnership with the European banking consortium controlled by the Valerius royal family for 5 years. It was the white whale of their corporate existence. The head of that family, universally referred to in the global financial sector simply as the Emperor, was a man of mythical wealth and untouchable power. He was royalty, a reigning sovereign whose word could bankrupt nations. He never attended public events. He never visited the United States. The doors of the lead Maybach swung open. Out stepped 4 men in tailored suits, their lapels adorned with the Valerius crest. They moved with military precision, flanking the doors of the mansion. Then the Emperor stepped out. Emperor Johannes Valerius was a towering figure in his late 60s, with a sharp, aristocratic jawline and piercing gray eyes that commanded absolute obedience. He wore a dark, impeccably tailored overcoat draped over his shoulders. Eleanor almost tripped over her own gown as she rushed forward, shoving Madeline aside. Her face was contorted into a mask of desperate, sycophantic joy. "Your Majesty!" Eleanor gasped, executing a deep, flawless curtsy. Winston von der Art Harrison's father practically ran from the ballroom, bowing profusely. "Emperor Johannes, we are beyond honored. We had no idea you were coming. Please come inside out of the cold." Emperor Johannes did not look at Eleanor. He did not look at Winston. He stopped halfway up the steps. His piercing gray eyes scanned the shivering crowd outside. He ignored the groveling billionaires entirely and turned his gaze to the side of the stairs where Robert and Martha were standing in the freezing wind, flanked by the very security guards who had just shoved them. The Emperor's icy demeanor suddenly shattered. A warm, brilliant smile spread across his weathered face. He bypassed Eleanor completely, walking straight toward the humble clockmaker. "Robert, my old friend Emperor Johannes," boomed his deep voice carrying over the howling wind. "It has been far too long." To the absolute shock and horror of every billionaire, socialite, and security guard, present the untouchable, ruthless emperor of the global elite threw his arms around the working-class man from Brooklyn, embracing him in a tight, brotherly hug. Robert smiled gently, patting the emperor on the back. "Good to see you, Johannes. I'm sorry to call you on such short notice." "Nonsense." The emperor pulled back his eyes, locking onto the terrified security guards who were now shaking violently. "When the man who saved my life 30 years ago calls, I answer. Now." The emperor turned slowly, his gaze sweeping over Eleanor von der Art. The warmth in his eyes vanished, replaced by an arctic fury that made the freezing wind feel like a summer breeze. "Who is the imbecile that locked my brother out in the cold?" The silence that fell over the grand foyer of the Rosecliff mansion was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic, unforgiving howl of the freezing coastal wind whipping through the violently opened oak doors. The ultra-wealthy, the politicians, the media moguls. They all stood completely paralyzed, their vintage champagne flutes suspended in midair. The collective gaze of the American elite was locked onto a single impossible tableau. Emperor Johannes Valerius, the undisputed monarch of global finance and European royalty, standing on the icy stone steps, his arm draped protectively over the shoulders of Robert the humble, calloused clockmaker from Brooklyn. Eleanor von der Art's perfectly sculpted face twitched violently, her mind usually a terrifying steel trap of social calculations and vicious maneuvering completely short-circuited. She looked from the towering emperor to Robert, her mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. Winston von der Art. Harrison's father was visibly trembling in his custom tuxedo. His life's work, the multi-billion-dollar corporate merger with the Valerius European Banking Consortium, was suddenly hanging by a microscopic fraying thread, and he knew it. He stepped forward, his hands clasped together in a desperate, pathetic, pleading gesture. Your Majesty," Winston stammered, his voice cracking with immense panic. "There has been a tremendous misunderstanding today, a severe lapse in communication with our private security firm. Please, I beg of you, come inside out of this weather. We have reserved the presidential suite for your arrival. We have the finest Silence, Emperor Johannes commanded. He did not yell. He did not need to raise his voice at all. The single quietly spoken word dropped from his lips like a heavy iron anvil, instantly crushing Winston's frantic babbling. The Emperor's piercing gray eyes, cold and entirely merciless, locked onto Eleanor. She shrank under his intense gaze, instinctively stepping backward, until her spine hit the ornate marble wall of the grand foyer. Johannes slowly turned his attention to the 4 burly, trench-coated security guards who had only moments ago forcefully shoved Robert. The guards were now sweating profusely despite the freezing Rhode Island temperature. "You put your hands on this man," Johannes said softly, a dangerous razor-sharp edge lining his aristocratic tone. "You shoved the man who saved my life into the ice. You attempted to banish him to a vendor tent in a winter storm. He signaled with a brief dismissive flick of his wrist. Two of his impeccably dressed, terrifyingly silent royal guards stepped forward immediately. "Remove these imbeciles from my sight," Johannes ordered. "Ensure they never find employment in the private security sector again, on any continent. They are permanently finished." The guards were swiftly and silently escorted away into the snow, offering absolutely zero resistance, completely terrified of the inevitable consequences. Johannes turned back to the trembling van der Art family. He placed a heavy, reassuring hand on Robert's shoulder. The entire mansion held its breath. 32 years ago, long before I assumed the throne of my house, I was a foolish, arrogant young man with a dangerous affinity for reckless sailing off the jagged coast of Malta. Johannes began, his deep voice echoing beautifully off the gilded ceilings. "A sudden violent squall tore my vessel apart. I was severely injured, trapped beneath a burning fiberglass hull, drowning in the Mediterranean Sea, and entirely abandoned by my cowardly crew." Johannes paused, his eyes sweeping over the silent, terrified crowd, making absolutely sure every single billionaire and socialite heard his next words clearly. A young American naval mechanic on leave and passing by in a rented, dilapidated fishing boat saw the fiery wreckage. While others safely sailed away from the explosion, he drove his boat directly into the flames. He dove into the burning, churning water. He shattered the reinforced glass with his bare hands, dragged my unconscious body from the sinking wreckage, and forcefully resuscitated me on the wooden deck of his tiny boat. He asked for absolutely no reward. He asked for no royal recognition. When I finally awoke, revealed my identity, and offered him anything in my kingdom, he simply smiled, told me to be careful next time, and gave me his dry jacket. Johannes reached deep into his dark cashmere overcoat and produced the heavy tarnished silver coin Robert had texted him a picture of earlier that evening. He held it up to the chandelier light. "I gave him the royal seal of the House of Valerius. I told him that if he ever required the full, unmitigated wrath and immense power of my bloodline, he needed only to show this coin. For 3 long decades, he never called. Not for money, not for political power, not for social prestige." The emperor took a slow, highly menacing step into the foyer, finally crossing the threshold of the mansion. The temperature in the room seemed to plummet even further, freezing the blood of everyone present. "And today, the very first and only time my brother calls upon his life debt, it is because you, Eleanor van der Art, decided he was not good enough to walk through the front doors of his own daughter's wedding." Eleanor burst into loud, hysterical tears. It was an ugly, desperate sobbing born of pure terror, not genuine remorse. "I didn't know," she wailed wildly, throwing her manicured hands up in the air. "I swear to you, Emperor Johannes, I had absolutely no idea. If we had known of his connections, we would have given him the seat of honor. We would have given him the entire mansion to host the reception." That is precisely the point, you vile, fundamentally pathetic woman." Johannes spat, his disgust absolutely palpable. "You measure a human being's worth strictly by their utility and their social connections, not by their character. You saw a brilliant, honorable man with calluses on his hands and deemed him garbage. You forced his beautiful, kind-hearted wife to wear this insulting, hideous garment." He gestured angrily toward Martha, who was shivering but standing tall beside her husband. "You systematically attempted to strip them of their dignity." Madeline, who had been standing frozen on the grand staircase, felt a sudden, massive surge of adrenaline rush through her veins. The oppressive, suffocating fog that had clouded her mind for 6 months instantly vanished. She looked directly at Harrison. He was staring at the marble floor, completely refusing to make eye contact with her, with his mother, or with the emperor. He was a spectacular coward, paralyzed entirely by the impending destruction of his massive inheritance. "Harrison." Madeline called out, her voice ringing perfectly clear and overwhelmingly steady above the howling wind and the panicked murmurs of the elite crowd. Harrison flinched violently, finally looking up with terrified eyes. Maddie, please, we can fix this. My father will fix this. We can explain." Madeline slowly descended the remaining marble steps. She did not run. She walked with the immense unshakable dignity of her father. She stopped perfectly in the center of the foyer, directly between the groveling Van der Arts and the towering emperor. There is nothing left to fix, Harrison. Madeline said, her eyes completely cold. Because there is no longer a wedding. Loud echoing gasps immediately rippled through the opulent grand hall of the Rosecliff mansion. The sheer audacity of Madeline's declaration struck the breathless crowd with the brutal force of a physical blow. A prominent state senator dropped his expensive champagne flute. The crystal shattered violently against the marble flooring, but nobody even blinked. All eyes remained hopelessly glued to the magnificent, terrifying spectacle unfolding in the grand foyer. Harrison Van der Art's face flushed a deep, sickly, unnatural crimson. He stepped forward, reaching out a violently trembling hand toward Madeline. Maddie, you cannot be serious right now. We have 800 incredibly important guests here. The international press is waiting right outside the gates. You're just emotionally upset. My mother was wrong, all right. She was completely out of line today. I will make her deeply apologize right this second. Madeline looked at the weak man she had almost pledged her entire life to and felt absolutely nothing. No lingering anger, no profound sadness, just a deep, overwhelming sense of pathetic pity. You will make her apologize because the emperor of the Valerius dynasty is standing in your foyer threatening your money, Harrison. Not because it was fundamentally the right thing to do. You stood by and watched her systematically torture my family for 6 entire months. You watched her strip away my mother's confidence. You watched her banish my heroic father to a vendor tent in a freezing coastal storm, and you did absolutely nothing to stop it. I tried to carefully manage her. Harrison pleaded desperately, his voice dangerously bordering on a pathetic whine. The sheer weakness radiating from him was utterly astonishing to witness. You know exactly how she is. You have to constantly compromise in this elite world, Madeline. We were going to be so happy tomorrow. I will never build a marriage on the burning ashes of my parents' dignity. Madeline replied firmly, her posture immaculate. She reached down to her left hand and gripped the 5-carat flawless emerald-cut diamond ring, the beautiful symbol of her golden, suffocating cage. With a swift, incredibly deliberate motion, she pulled it forcefully off her finger. The ring felt suddenly entirely worthless, merely a heavy, cold piece of compressed carbon that carried the terrible weight of a miserable, heavily controlled lifetime. She tossed it casually onto the polished marble floor. It bounced with a sharp, echoing metallic clatter, rolling to a complete stop directly at Eleanor Van der Art's trembling, designer-clad feet. "Keep your expensive jewelry, Eleanor," Madeline said, her clear voice dripping with absolute, unadulterated contempt. "Keep your toxic high society, keep your generational blood money, and firmly keep your spineless son. I am a historic preservationist by trade, Mrs. Van der Art. I professionally fix broken things, but your family is entirely beyond repair." Emperor Johannes watched the young woman with a look of profound, genuine admiration shining in his gray eyes. He turned to Robert, a warm, bright smile finally breaking completely through his icy royal facade. "She certainly possesses your legendary iron spine, my friend. A truly magnificent woman. She deeply deserves a spectacular kingdom, not a restrictive cage." Robert smiled broadly, pulling his brave daughter into a tight, incredibly warm embrace. Martha immediately hugged them, both hot tears of relief and overwhelming maternal pride streaming rapidly down her face. The horrible, suffocating beige dress no longer mattered in the slightest. She was entirely surrounded by the fierce, unconditional love of her family. Winston Van der Art, completely realizing his son's strategic marriage was entirely dead, and his company's financial future was rapidly evaporating into thin air, fell forcefully to his knees in a display of pathetic, complete desperation. He actually crawled toward Emperor Johannes, totally ignoring the horrified, gossiping stares of his incredibly wealthy peers. "Your Majesty, I sincerely implore you, do not let the terrible actions of my foolish wife and son destroy our massive corporate alliance. The Valerius von der Art merger is officially scheduled to be signed on Tuesday morning. We have billions of dollars tied up heavily in the international escrow accounts. The Emperor looked down at the groveling Winston with the absolute icy disdain one might specifically reserve for a crushed, annoying insect. He slowly pulled a sleek, highly encrypted satellite phone from his dark overcoat pocket and precisely dialed a single digit. The grand foyer was so utterly terrifyingly silent that everyone present could easily hear the faint electronic ringing from the earpiece. Sebastian Johannes spoke clearly into the phone, his commanding voice carrying the terrifying, crushing weight of absolute global authority. Cancel the pending merger with the von der Art enterprise immediately. Liquidate all our shared assets, trigger the severe penalty clauses in all the preliminary contracts, and pull every single cent of Valerius capital from their subsidiary hedge funds. Yes, right this exact second. Furthermore, officially issue a royal blacklist directive to the entire European banking consortium. Any global financial institution that underwrites a von der Art corporate loan from this exact moment forward will be permanently and entirely severed from the Valerius network. Winston von der Art collapsed completely onto the cold marble floor, painfully grasping his chest as he began to hyperventilate wildly. In less than 30 seconds, with a few casual, easily spoken sentences, the Emperor had not just canceled a lucrative business deal. He had effectively detonated a massive financial nuclear bomb that would completely obliterate the entire von der Art corporate legacy. By Monday morning, their vast empire would be totally insolvent, their company stock completely worthless, their family name totally toxic in all global markets. Eleanor let out a horrific, guttural, animalistic scream, desperately clutching the smooth walls of the foyer. The carefully constructed, elegant facade of the powerful Upper East Side matriarch completely shattered into a million pieces, leaving behind a ruined, terrifyingly hysterical woman. She lunged violently toward Madeline, her sharp, manicured claws fully extended. "You totally ruined us. You filthy, low-class little..." Before Eleanor could take 2 full steps, the Emperor's highly trained royal guards violently intercepted her, slamming her roughly back against the hard marble wall with brutal, uncompromising physical efficiency. She slid down to the floor, sobbing uncontrollably, her incredibly expensive diamond necklace badly tangled, and her perfect salon hair completely ruined. Johannes completely ignored the aggressively screaming woman and turned his full, polite attention back to Robert, Martha, and Madeline. He gracefully swept his arm toward the open oak doors, where the massive fleet of heavily armored jet-black Maybachs sat idling quietly in the freezing coastal wind. "My private jet is currently fully fueled and waiting patiently on the tarmac at Providence Airport. My private estate in Lake Como is quite beautiful this time of year, completely absent of freezing snow, and fully staffed with excellent individuals who actually know how to correctly treat highly honorable guests. Shall we depart, my dear friends?" Robert looked fondly at his wonderful wife, who nodded enthusiastically, a brilliant, beautiful smile finally gracing her tear-stained face. He looked at his brave daughter, who wiped a stray, happy tear from her cheek and stood significantly taller than she ever had in her entire life. "Lake Como sounds absolutely perfect right now, Johannes," Robert said warmly, happily clapping the powerful Emperor on the shoulder. The 3 of them decisively turned their backs on the utterly ruined, loudly sobbing van der Art family, turning away entirely from the 800 completely paralyzed, speechless billionaires, and walked proudly out of the grand Rosecliff mansion. They walked safely down the icy stone steps, completely shielded from the freezing coastal wind by the towering immense presence of Emperor Johannes Valerius and his elite, terrifying royal guard. Madeline stepped gratefully into the plush, deeply heated leather interior of the lead Maybach. As the heavy armored doors safely clicked shut instantly, silencing the agonizing wails of her former mother-in-law, she looked quietly out the dark tinted window. She watched the grand, imposing Rosecliff mansion rapidly fade into the gray distance as the royal convoy tore aggressively down the long gravel driveway, completely leaving the toxic, superficial world of the elite far behind forever. She was definitely no longer a captive in a gilded cage. She was a deeply proud daughter of a clockmaker, a strong woman of absolute unshakable worth, completely free and heading swiftly toward a brilliant, entirely unwritten future. The weekend following the catastrophic aborted wedding in Newport was not spent in quiet mourning for the Van der Art family. It was spent in a state of absolute frantic terror. Winston van der Art had immediately commandeered his private helicopter flying directly from Rhode Island to the helipad of his towering corporate headquarters in the financial district of Lower Manhattan. For 48 straight hours, a deeply sweating, panicked army of corporate lawyers, crisis management public relations executives, and senior financial analysts desperately tried to build a defensive barricade. They believed they could somehow mitigate the damage. They fundamentally underestimated the terrifying efficiency of Emperor Johannes Valerius. When the opening bell violently rang at the New York Stock Exchange at exactly 9:30 a.m. on Monday morning, the true apocalyptic scale of the emperor's wrath was finally revealed to the global public. It was not merely a cancellation of a single merger. It was a highly coordinated, systemic financial execution. The Valerius royal family did not just hold wealth, they controlled the incredibly deep hidden pipelines of global liquidity. The moment the markets opened, the glowing Bloomberg terminals on the trading floors of every major international bank from Morgan Stanley in New York to UBS in Zurich flashed violent, angry red across all Van der Art holdings. Within the first 15 minutes of trading, the brutal reality of the Valerius Royal blacklist took full effect. The catastrophic sequence of events unfolded with merciless precision, 9:31 a.m. The Valerius European Banking Consortium officially filed public declarations pulling a combined $4.2 billion in capital backing from the Van der Art real estate development funds. 9:38 a.m., Deutsche Bank and BNP Paribas, terrified of being permanently severed from the Valerius network, immediately called in all heavily leveraged margin loans previously extended to Winston's subsidiary companies, demanding full cash repayment within 24 hours. 9:45 a.m. Three major institutional investors who had witnessed the horrifying humiliation of Robert and Martha at the Rosecliff Mansion firsthand publicly announced their total divestment from the Van der Art portfolio, citing irreconcilable ethical concerns regarding executive leadership. By 10 a.m., the Van der Art corporate stock had plummeted an absolutely staggering 68%. Trading was forcefully halted by the Securities and Exchange Commission due to unprecedented, chaotic volatility. Up in his sprawling, glass-walled executive penthouse office, Winston van der Art stood frozen, staring completely blankly at the massive digital ticker tape running across his wall. He looked 20 years older than he had on Saturday morning. His custom-tailored suit was heavily wrinkled, his silk tie loosened his eyes, completely bloodshot and utterly devoid of hope. His entire legacy, built ruthlessly over 4 generations of aggressive Manhattan real estate acquisitions, was systematically burning to the ground in less than an hour. His lead corporate counsel, a sharp, usually unshakable man named Peter Sterling, who had just realized his massive retainer was likely never going to be paid, walked slowly into the office. Peter did not even bother to sit down. No, Sturpert, it is entirely over. Winston. Peter set his voice flat, completely stripped of any professional deference. The international escrow accounts have been completely frozen by the Swiss regulators at the direct request of the House of Valerius. The sudden massive margin calls from the European banks have rendered the holding company utterly insolvent. We do not have the liquid cash to cover even 10% of the demanded repayments. There has to be a legal loophole. Winston whispered desperately, gripping the edge of his mahogany desk so tightly his knuckles turned completely white. We can file emergency injunctions. We can sue Valerius for bad faith breach of contract. There was a preliminary agreement. You cannot successfully sue the Emperor of the European financial markets. Winston Sound. Peter replied, shaking his head with profound pity. He explicitly triggered the morality and gross negligence penalty clauses embedded deep within page 400 of the preliminary merger documents. Clauses your own legal team approved because nobody ever assumes they will actively offend the ruling monarch of a royal house. Furthermore, the public relations nightmare is absolutely radioactive. Cell phone footage of your wife screaming hysterically while Madeline threw the 5-carat engagement ring at her feet has just leaked to page 6 in the Financial Times. You are a total pariah. Meanwhile, strictly confined within the suffocating silent walls of their $40 million Upper East Side penthouse, Eleanor van der Art was experiencing a completely different yet equally devastating form of total destruction. Her absolute power had always entirely resided in her exclusive social currency. She ruled the elite charity gala boards, the country club admission committees, and the prestigious museum trustee councils with an iron, unforgiving fist. On Monday morning, her personal cell phone, usually ringing incessantly with desperate socialites, begging for her highly coveted approval, was completely silent. The silence was deafening. It was the terrifying sound of total social excommunication. Around noon, a heavy, expensive envelope was hand-delivered to the penthouse by a private courier. Eleanor's hands trembled violently as she tore it open. It was a formal, extremely legally binding letter from the board of directors of the Metropolitan Historic Arts Foundation, the very board she had ruthlessly chaired for a decade. The letter stated coldly that her continued presence was an unacceptable reputational liability, effectively demanding her immediate, unconditional resignation. Harrison van der Art was entirely absent from his mother's profound misery and his father's catastrophic corporate ruin. He was currently sitting alone in the dark, heavily wood-paneled bar of a private members club in Soho, intensely staring at his phone. He had dialed Madeline's number 74 times over the weekend. Every single call had gone directly to voicemail. He had sent perfectly crafted, desperate text messages begging for her profound forgiveness, completely promising to entirely cut his toxic parents out of his life, falsely swearing that he had truly loved her all along. The reality was that Harrison finally understood the massive, unforgivable mistake he had made. He had cowardly chosen the comforting illusion of his family's suffocating wealth over the genuine, absolute loyalty of the woman he loved. And now he had absolutely nothing. The wealth was rapidly evaporating into thin air, and the woman was entirely gone. He took a heavy, burning sip of straight whiskey, suddenly realizing that he was completely incapable of functioning in the real world without his father's massive bank accounts, protecting him from the harsh consequences of his profound cowardice. The van der Art family empire, once considered a terrifying, untouchable titan of American generational wealth, had been completely brought to its knees, utterly destroyed by a single catastrophic error in judgment. They had arrogantly assumed that the quiet, humble clockmaker from Brooklyn was weak, while the chaotic, incredibly brutal financial massacre played out entirely in the cold, unforgiving concrete canyons of Manhattan. A world away, Madeline was quietly experiencing a profound, beautiful resurrection. The private Gulfstream jet belonging to Emperor Johannes Valerius had touched down smoothly in Milan on Sunday morning. From there, a private helicopter had aggressively swept them over the breathtaking snow-capped peaks of the Italian Alps, finally descending toward the magnificent, sparkling blue waters of Lake Como. Their final destination was a legendary, incredibly secluded royal estate completely owned by the House of Valerius, positioned perfectly on a heavily wooded peninsula jutting out into the deep, tranquil lake. The estate was a staggering masterpiece of 18th century Italian Renaissance architecture. It featured terraced, perfectly manicured botanical gardens, filled with blooming hydrangeas towering ancient cypress trees, and classical marble statues that completely overlooked the vast expanse of the water. Inside the massive villa was a quiet symphony of priceless antique tapestries, intricately frescoed ceilings, and deeply polished mahogany floors. But unlike the suffocating, highly weaponized luxury of the van der Art family, the immense wealth of Emperor Johannes was offered entirely as a warm, protective sanctuary. The massive staff of the estate, dressed impeccably in crisp uniforms, treated Robert, Martha, and Madeline with absolute, genuine reverence, entirely devoid of the toxic, calculating snobbery they had experienced in Rhode Island. On their third day at the magnificent estate, Madeline finally felt the deep, lingering tension completely leave her shoulders. She was wearing a simple, comfortable linen dress, her bare feet resting quietly on the warm stone of the grand terrace overlooking the lake. The golden, warm Italian sun felt like a gentle, healing embrace after the bitterly freezing nightmare of Newport. She watched fondly as her father Robert sat at a small wrought iron table a few yards away, deeply engaged in a warm, relaxed conversation with Emperor Johannes. The two men, vastly different in their worldly status, sat together as true equal brothers. Johannes had entirely shed his terrifying, commanding imperial persona, dressed comfortably in a light cotton shirt and casual trousers. He was laughing loudly at a story Robert was telling about a particularly stubborn grandfather clock he had recently repaired in Brooklyn. Martha was inside the villa, happily being treated to a world-class private spa experience by the royal staff, finally receiving the absolute pampering and profound respect she had always deeply deserved. Johannes suddenly stood up and slowly walked over to where Madeline was quietly sitting. He carried two delicate porcelain cups of strong Italian espresso, offering one to her with a warm, grandfatherly smile. "I trust you are finally finding some genuine peace here, Madeline," Johannes asked softly, taking a seat beside her on the sun-drenched terrace. "It is incredibly beautiful, Johannes," Madeline replied sincerely, wrapping her hands around the warm cup. "I cannot possibly thank you enough for everything you have done. You completely saved my family from a horrible nightmare. I merely balanced an extremely old scale, my dear," Johannes said quietly, looking out over the sparkling water. "Your father is a truly extraordinary man. When he pulled me from that burning wreckage 30 years ago, he taught me a profound lesson about the absolute immeasurable value of quiet, selfless honor. A lesson my own wealthy, privileged family completely failed to teach me." He paused, taking a slow sip of his espresso, his sharp gray eyes suddenly turning incredibly serious. "I have spent the last 3 days extensively reviewing your professional portfolio, Madeline. The historic preservation work you executed on those 19th century brownstones in Brooklyn is absolutely masterful. You possess a brilliant, highly intuitive eye for structural integrity and historical authenticity." Madeline blushed slightly, deeply surprised. You looked into my career. I am the emperor of a massive ancient dynasty." Johannes smiled warmly. "It is my explicit business to know the absolute capabilities of the people I deeply respect, and I currently have a rather significant, highly complex problem that requires exactly your specific brilliant expertise." Johannes reached into his pocket and placed a heavy, beautifully bound leather folder onto the table in front of her. Madeline slowly opened it. Inside were high-resolution aerial photographs, incredibly detailed architectural blueprints, and hundreds of pages of structural reports concerning a massive, breathtakingly beautiful, but heavily ruined 14th century castle located deep within the rolling hills of Tuscany. "This is the Castello di Vento," Johannes explained, pointing to the primary photograph. "It has belonged entirely to the Valerius family for over 600 years. It is a vital, totally irreplaceable piece of our deep ancestral heritage. However, the previous generations severely neglected it. The primary foundation is actively crumbling, the priceless historical frescoes are fading, and the ancient stone masonry is aggressively failing." He looked directly into Madeline's eyes, his expression completely resolute. "I have fired 4 different international restoration firms in the past year alone. They lack the genuine passion, the deep historical respect, and the quiet, meticulous dedication required to properly save it. They only see the massive budget. They do not see the soul of the building." Johannes leaned forward, resting his hands on the table. "I want you to become the entirely autonomous lead director of historical restoration for the House of Valerius. The Castello di Vento will be your primary, absolute responsibility. You will be granted an entirely unlimited operational budget, complete creative control, and the authority to aggressively hire any international artisans or structural engineers you require. I want you to bring my ancestral home completely back to life." Madeline was completely stunned. She stared at the incredibly detailed blueprints, her highly trained architectural mind already racing with brilliant, exciting possibilities. This was not a charity handout. This was a massive, incredibly complex professional challenge, the absolute pinnacle of her chosen career field. It was an opportunity to build a tremendous lasting legacy purely on her own immense merit. "Yeah, Johannes, this is a monumental undertaking." Madeline stammered, completely overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of the royal offer. It would take several years to complete properly. Excellent. Johannes smiled broadly, extremely pleased by her entirely realistic assessment. That means you and your wonderful parents will have an excellent reason to visit Italy quite frequently. Your father has already explicitly agreed to personally oversee the complete restoration of the castle's massive, intricate medieval clock tower. He finds the challenge heavily intriguing. Madeline looked over at Robert, who offered her a quiet, profoundly proud nod. He had never needed the massive wealth or the terrifying power of the emperor. He had only ever used the royal coin to violently protect his daughter. And now, out of the ashes of that terrible protection, a brilliant, completely beautiful new path had naturally forged itself. Madeline placed her hands firmly on the leather folder, a fierce, entirely unshakable confidence blooming rapidly in her chest. She'd completely survived the toxic gilded cage of the von der Arts. She had firmly reclaimed her absolute dignity, and now she was officially going to rebuild an empire. I deeply accept the position, Johannes. Madeline said, her voice ringing perfectly clear and overwhelmingly strong in the warm Italian air. We will restore the castle entirely to its former glory. I completely guarantee it. The velvet guillotine had fallen definitively on her past, completely severing her from the horrible, suffocating world of toxic high society. Sitting on the sunlit terrace overlooking Lake Como, surrounded entirely by profound, unconditional love and absolute respect, Madeline finally truly began her extraordinary new life. 2 years after the catastrophic events at the Rosecliff Mansion, the once untouchable von der Art empire had been reduced to a pathetic cautionary tale whispered in the hallowed halls of elite business schools. The systemic financial execution initiated by Emperor Johannes Valerius did not merely bankrupt Winston von der Art, it entirely exposed the rotting, corrupt foundation of his entire life's work. When the massive European banking consortium aggressively pulled their capital investments on that fateful Monday morning, it created a devastating liquidity vacuum that Winston simply could not survive. Desperate to cover the immediate margin calls from furious international lenders, Winston had foolishly attempted to illegally move massive sums of corporate funds from heavily restricted employee pension accounts. It was a fatal, incredibly arrogant mistake driven by pure panic. The United States Securities and Exchange Commission, explicitly tipped off by the ruthless forensic accountants employed by the House of Valerius, launched a massive, unforgiving federal probe into the von der Art holding companies. Within 6 agonizing months of the disastrous canceled wedding, Winston was officially indicted by the Department of Justice on 42 federal counts of wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and gross financial mismanagement. The man who had previously commanded global markets and bullied prominent politicians was currently serving a miserable 10-year sentence in the harsh, unforgiving confines of a federal correctional institution. His bespoke tailored suits had been permanently traded for a deeply humiliating, standard-issue bright orange prison jumpsuit. Eleanor von der Art's profound social descent was equally spectacular, incredibly swift, and brutally public. When the federal government legally seized their remaining corporate and personal assets to systematically pay off infuriated institutional investors, Eleanor was violently stripped of her carefully curated gilded cage. The sprawling, beautifully manicured Hamptons estate, the breathtaking $40 million Manhattan penthouse overlooking Central Park, and the entire fleet of heavily armored chauffeured vehicles were immediately liquidated by unsympathetic federal auditors. Even her absolute most cherished possessions, a heavily guarded, heavily insured collection of rare Hermès Birkin bags and vintage Cartier diamond jewelry, was forcefully auctioned off at Sotheby's to settle the massive outstanding debts left in Winston's destructive wake. Stripped completely of her vast generational wealth, her powerful social currency evaporated entirely overnight. The ruthless Upper East Side elite, instantly sensing blood in the water and terrified of being associated with a convicted federal felon, entirely blacklisted her from their glamorous, highly exclusive lives. Eleanor was eventually forced to quietly relocate to a cramped, heavily outdated, distinctly foul-smelling 2-bedroom apartment in the deepest, loudest part of Astoria, Queens. the haughty, intensely cruel woman who had once deemed a beautiful botanical garden entirely too low class for her son's wedding reception, now spent her miserable days loudly arguing with her exhausted landlord about a permanently broken heating radiator. She was entirely ignored by the glamorous world she used to violently rule, wandering the crowded city sidewalks as a completely forgotten ghost of high society. As for Harrison, the harsh, unforgiving reality of the working-class world hit him with the brutal absolute force of a runaway freight train. Without his father's vast fortune to artificially insulate him from the consequences of his own profound mediocrity, Harrison quickly discovered he possessed absolutely zero marketable life skills. His expensive Ivy League degree, previously secured entirely through massive generational legacy donations and aggressive backroom networking, was totally useless when unaccompanied by the intimidating Van der Art influence. After completely failing 16 consecutive entry-level corporate interviews at prominent financial companies like Vanguard and Fidelity Investments, Harrison finally secured incredibly menial employment just to keep himself from starving on the harsh city streets. He now worked as a miserable junior customer service representative at a heavily trafficked enterprise car rental desk at Newark Liberty International Airport. He spent 40 agonizing hours a week wearing a cheap, poorly fitted polyester uniform, aggressively yelled at by exhausted, furious travelers over missing vehicle reservations and hidden insurance fees. The ultimate agonizing twist to his profound personal misery came on a deeply rainy, miserably cold Tuesday morning. Harrison, totally exhausted from working a brutal double shift at the bustling rental desk, walked slowly into a local airport newsstand to buy a cheap, watered-down cup of black coffee. As he stood quietly in the long checkout line, his deeply tired, heavily bloodshot eyes drifted casually to the prominent magazine rack displayed near the register. Staring directly back at him from the glossy, highly prestigious cover of Architectural Digest was Madeline. She looked absolutely breathtaking, standing powerfully and confidently in front of a magnificent, heavily restored, deeply ancient Italian castle. The bold golden headline printed directly beneath her beautiful face read, "The mastermind behind the masterpiece. How Madeline rebuilt the historic Valerius legacy." Harrison dropped his paper coffee cup, the scalding brown liquid splattering aggressively over his cheap polyester shoes and the dirty linoleum floor. He stumbled blindly out of the busy airport store, the absolute crushing weight of his catastrophic personal failure finally breaking his spirit completely. He finally understood the agonizing truth: Madeline had never actually needed his family's toxic wealth to properly succeed. She had possessed a brilliant, totally unshakable empire within her all along. The Van der Arts hadn't just lost their massive corporate fortune, they had foolishly discarded the only genuinely valuable person who had ever walked into their incredibly hollow, utterly pathetic lives. 3,000 miles away, nestled deeply within the beautifully rolling, sun-drenched hills of the lush Tuscan countryside, the magnificent Castello di Vento was enthusiastically preparing for a spectacular, profoundly historic rebirth. Over the past 3 incredible years, Madeline had poured her entire soul, her brilliant intellect, and her fierce dedication into the massive historical restoration project. Operating with the completely unlimited operational budget graciously provided by Emperor Johannes Valerius, she had systematically hired the absolute most talented stonemasons from Florence and the finest highly trained fresco restorers directly from Rome. She treated the ancient, actively crumbling castle not as a totally lifeless relic to be aggressively modernized, but as a heavily wounded, deeply respected patient that desperately needed profound healing and genuine meticulous care. The grand, highly anticipated unveiling gala was formally scheduled for a beautifully crisp Saturday evening in late September. The incredibly exclusive guest list was a staggering, deeply impressive assembly of global European royalty, extremely prominent international politicians, and the absolute most respected names in the global architectural community. A massive fleet of heavily armored luxury vehicles wound gracefully up the steep, winding, cypress-lined driveway, depositing the excited global elite at the massive, perfectly restored ancient oak doors of the central castle courtyard. Inside the sprawling estate, the total physical transformation was absolutely breathtaking. The formerly failing medieval foundation had been entirely stabilized, utilizing brilliant cutting-edge structural engineering techniques entirely designed by Madeline. The priceless 14th century ceiling frescoes, previously hidden completely beneath centuries of dark soot and profound tragic neglect, now glowed brilliantly with vibrant, stunning historical accuracy. The massive, heavily vaulted grand ballroom, softly and beautifully illuminated by hundreds of delicate, custom-forged iron chandeliers, buzzed loudly with profound, genuine admiration. World-renowned culinary masters personally curated by the legendary Massimo Bottura served an exquisitely detailed menu of regional Italian delicacies and vintage wines to the completely mesmerized, incredibly wealthy crowd. However, the absolute crown jewel of the magnificent restoration was not located inside the grand ballroom. It was beautifully positioned high above the ancient echoing stone courtyard. Emperor Johannes, dressed flawlessly in a sharp, impeccably tailored dark tuxedo, stepped proudly onto the grand marble balcony, completely overlooking the spectacular party. He gently tapped his fine crystal champagne glass with a silver spoon, instantly bringing the massive, bustling crowd to a total, highly respectful silence. "My esteemed, deeply honored friends," Johannes began his deep, commanding imperial voice, carrying beautifully across the cool, incredibly clear evening air. Exactly 3 years ago, I proudly entrusted the incredibly fragile, deeply historic soul of my ancient ancestral home to a brilliant, fiercely determined young woman from America. I asked her to carefully resurrect the deep history of the Valerius dynasty. She completely, utterly exceeded my absolute highest expectations. Johannes smiled warmly, gesturing gracefully toward the massive crowd waiting below. "Please join me in completely honoring the totally unparalleled genius of our lead director of historical restoration, the magnificent Madeline." The massive courtyard immediately erupted into deafening, completely genuine, totally thunderous applause. Madeline, wearing a stunning, incredibly elegant emerald green silk designer gown that perfectly complemented her radiant, unshakable confidence, gracefully ascended the grand stone stairs to personally join the emperor on the high balcony. She did not shrink back nervously from the overwhelming, highly focused attention. She stood incredibly tall, her head held extremely high, completely commanding the profound respect of the absolute most powerful people on the entire planet. She looked down warmly into the cheering, deeply appreciative crowd, and immediately found the two absolute most important people in her entire world. Robert and Martha were standing proudly together near the exact center of the beautiful courtyard. Martha was happily wearing a completely gorgeous, deeply flattering, custom-tailored designer gown, chosen entirely by herself, proudly radiating deep maternal joy and absolute peace. Robert wore a flawless, sharply tailored, bespoke Italian suit, looking absolutely every bit as distinguished and deeply honorable as the prominent European royalty standing right beside him. "Okay, thank you, Your Majesty." Madeline spoke clearly into the microphone, her beautiful voice incredibly steady and profoundly confident. "This incredible ancient castle has stood fiercely against the elements for 600 years, because it was initially built on a totally unshakable foundation of deep honor and profound resilience. I merely utilized my skills to help it properly remember its own massive inherent strength. But the true, beating heartbeat of this incredible estate absolutely required a very special, deeply personal touch." Madeline turned completely toward the towering, intricately carved stone clock tower, beautifully situated directly adjacent to the main fortress keep. It had been totally silent, deeply broken, and fundamentally ignored for over an entire century. My wonderful father Robert spent the entire last year meticulously rebuilding the massive, incredibly complex internal brass mechanisms of the central clock tower entirely by hand. Madeline announced proudly, her eyes shining brightly with deep familial love. "Tonight, we officially beautifully restart the heart of the Castello di Vento. Right on perfect cue, the heavy, intricately restored golden brass hands of the massive clock clicked perfectly into their proper place, striking exactly midnight. A deep, incredibly rich, completely beautiful chiming sound echoed powerfully and majestically across the gently rolling Tuscan valleys. It was a profound, deeply resonant sound of total victory, absolute resilience, and undeniable permanent personal freedom. As the magnificent, perfectly tuned chimes rang out loudly, Emperor Johannes carefully placed a highly respectful, deeply brotherly hand directly on Robert's broad shoulder down in the courtyard. The powerful, immensely wealthy European monarch and the humble, fiercely honorable Brooklyn clockmaker stood happily side by side. They quietly watched the brilliant, fiercely independent woman they both deeply loved entirely conquer the world. Madeline had completely destroyed the toxic gilded cage meant to imprison her, and in its permanent place, she had masterfully built an eternal, profoundly beautiful empire, entirely of her own brilliant design. If you love this story of ultimate revenge and reclaiming personal dignity, please hit that like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more incredible real-life drama stories. Madeline's journey from a dismissed working-class bride to a celebrated, powerful mastermind, rebuilding historical empires, proves that true worth is not found in a bank account. It is built on respect and character. Drop a comment below and tell us what you would have done if you were in her shoes. Do not forget to ring the notification bell so you never miss out.